My camera not working.
Hi, everyone. I've got 11 bells here Central Time, so let's get started. We just have 60 minutes together, so I will kick us off. My name is Katie Miller. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Alia, and just so pleased to have everyone with us today. I'll start us off and then transition to Amelia Frank Meyer, our CEO, but let's do a little bit of housekeeping. It would be really awesome if people would turn on their cameras, and it kind of feels like we're in a room together instead of on TV. So it's just a little bit more fun and engaging. We will be sharing some inspirational stuff today and some really tactical, practical pieces about what it feels like and some of our recommendations from what we've learned about pushback to change. And it would be just so cool to see everyone, and feel free to use the chat as if we were just sitting around in a circle. We are circle people. So if you would use the chat or raise your hand, that type of thing, we would love to have your interaction. So it will be presented today, like I said, myself, but really mostly Amelia Frank Meyer. And we talked a lot about who would we have to come to this session, and we really wanted to make it be that, like, people that were on the ground doing the work to come and talk about this. And the more we really worked out who would be best to come, the more we went, gosh, we just don't want to put some of the leaders that we've worked with and learned from in a position to talk about really sensitive work in front of you all. So we are going to be speaking on their behalf. We've worked with a number of leaders across the country, and in recent and more distant history. And this is kind of a culmination of our best thinking around and learning around what happens when you try to make a big change, and where can that pushback come from. Like I said, Amelia will really go through those details with us. We've learned a lot of these lessons from the UnSystem innovation cohort that we convene. You can read a lot more about that on our website. But just wanted to say that this really, again, is kind of a collection of learning that we've gotten from our experience, from others in the field, from kind of other experts, people who literally wrote the book on, doing change in real time, in real spaces, in big real systems. So we are just so glad to have you here today to be part of this conversation. So with that, I will toss it to my colleague, Amelia Frank Meyer.
Thanks, Katie. So I'm Amelia, and we're going to spend the next few minutes here over the next hour talking through some of our lessons learned. I want to first kind of level up with people. Some of you might be kind of avid followers and know the story of where these lessons come from, and some of you may be newer to us. And so I'm going to just share my screen here and do a little bit about where the lessons come from. So we have been working in the area of change in child welfare for a number of years, and the more successful the change, the bigger the change, the bigger the pushback. And so we have invested ourselves in this idea of how do we prepare and protect change makers. That seems to be a really important part of the next phase of work. So I'll just say we have so much respect and so much awe for leaders who do this work on the front lines and who go first, who lay pathways that have not yet been laid, and in many cases pay a very significant price for that. Their reputation, their well-being, their livelihood, lots of very significant prices paid. So we are dedicated to learning everything we can about how to prepare others and to take those lessons learned and share them. So that's where some of this comes from. So a few quick slides on our history here. So in May of 2017, we invited 100 innovators from around the country to come together to redesign child welfare. And we spent 3.5 days with the global human-centered design firm IDEO to answer the question, how might we redesign a better child welfare system? We came up with a set of ideas that reflected that best thinking of those 100 innovators. And then we only had ideas. So we asked people to test them and try them in real life in systems. And we had 10 systems apply to do that. We tried to talk everybody out of it, and 5 remained. So these are the 5 who would not be daunted. Um, and they are Cass County, North Dakota, Eastern Service Region of Iowa, Eau Claire County, Wisconsin, Washington County, Maryland, and in the beginning part of this work was Wapaka County, Wisconsin. Over the last few months, there have been significant changes in Wapaka, including the board taking a formal vote to not continue to participate in the change work. And there's much more to that story to come at a later time, but for today, we want to just harvest the collective lessons. So it's important to note that these folks have been at this work now for about 2.5 years, and we have published a lot of this learning. You can get free downloadable on the website. But the year 1 cohort report, so in the first year of change work that we measured, there was an average reduction in foster care placements in 12%, of 12%, and an average reduction in residential placements of 37% without significant child injury or death. So children were not less safe, but they did have more opportunities to live in families, and preferably their own. So we have gathered this group of leaders when we used to gather, remember that, without masks and in offices, when we came together to share across sites the learning and to harvest everything we could about the impact of the change process. And that's what we really want to share with you today, are some tips and techniques and lessons learned around um, the backlash of change and how to prepare and protect yourself if you are a leader doing change, as well as if you're not a leader doing change, but you are someone who supports movements. And I will say, our work is really largely in child welfare systems reform, but we think these lessons apply across systems in criminal justice reform, juvenile justice reform, education reform, police reform. We think change makers who go first share a lot in common around this. So these are the lessons that we want to share. And Katie, I'm going to rely on you to monitor chat because I can't see it while I've got the slide up. So the first thing we wanted to just talk about is what to prepare before you start. And really, before you start, what we've learned is that it's so important to make the case for change, to have a clear vision about the change and a narrative about it, and to share that narrative often. So people really need to understand, another way to say this is the why of the change. So what are we doing and why? And to have really a lot of clarity around that. And that is important before you begin the process. To accompany that vision, it's really important to also have data that support your change narrative and the case for change. And we have done a lot of work in preparing the case for change. And so, again, all of these resources are available free for download on our website, but we have commissioned a social return on investment study, which shows for every dollar invested in doing foster care the way we have typically done it, we lose $9.55. And when we do it the way it's best done, we lose $3.64. And so that's available. We also have commissioned a literature review on the case against family separation, so that the research is there behind that. And the cohort case studies, the two of them, the early release and the other one, are chock full of information making the case for change as well. So we invite you really to use and share widely any of that information in your change process. Another piece that I want to talk about briefly here is sort of assessing readiness before jumping in. And this is an interesting thing because we are talking about the cohort, but we also work in jurisdictions around the country who aren't in our cohort. And so we have all lessons learned from lots of different places. And when I say assessing readiness for change, some of the other things that we're thinking about are lessons we've learned in and out of the cohort. And so one of the things we've learned is that a pushback to change can come from a whole variety of places. And so I'm just going to kind of list some of the places where we've seen pushback come from, just so you know it's not always really the obvious places. Sometimes we have seen it come from people in the schools because if you are trying to leave more children in their community, the schools have a lot more to, quote unquote, sort of deal with those kids. They're not getting sent out of county or put in juvenile detention or sent away to a residential. They have a lot more challenges to respond to with behaviors in the school. Sometimes it's police or sheriff because again, if we're leaving families intact who are struggling, they may have more work to do in terms of responding to those calls, or even just more worry about the risk of and safety challenges that they might share. And so, schools and police, we've seen pushback come from unions and staffing, where staff are concerned that the way they have done the work all up until now is going to be different than what they're going to be asked to do. And so those kinds of changes in requests of their roles or responsibilities or knowledge base, that can sometimes create pushback from union. We've seen pushback from county boards, and largely we've seen county boards in divided ways. So there are some in support and some not in support, and it really reflects a lot of the dynamics in our country in a lot of ways. And so there are those who are, maybe really concerned about cost, and others concerned about risk, and others concerned about what might kind of happen as a result of the change in terms of the community partners who might be kind of put off by the change and wanting to maintain cordial relationships in those ways. So that can really come from that area as well. We've also seen change pushback sometimes come from judges who really want to determine practice in their rulings, and a shift in practice that they're not aligned with doesn't go over well. So just a lot of it's foster parents, I mean, there's a huge loss to foster parents if we're not placing children and or adoptive parents, if there aren't more children, quote unquote, free for adoption or available for placement. That pushback can come there. It can come from nonprofits and community partners who maybe have done work in a way that was really part of the old way of work or holding up old ways of work. And then, there isn't a lot of funding for prevention right now. It's what we all need and want, but there's not a lot of funding. And so letting go of a contract where you're able to really have a significant resources coming in to serve children in residential ways or in other ways that have high net revenue from that, and go to something that doesn't have as big of a profit margin, or that there isn't as much dedicated funding, that can be scary too. So some of that pushback has come from community and nonprofit members. So you can see that and I'll tell you, in about every system we've worked in, the threat has come from one of those different places. So I just described to you about 7 different systems. It's not the same. This is something else we've learned. The pushback is not the same in every system. It really is so all politics is local, right? It's really dependent on what's happening in the local areas, where the sources of power are, where the relationships are and the connections, who has connection to who to kind of leverage a pushback. So just to kind of keep in mind, right, that the threats to stopping the change process can come from a lot of different places, and it takes a whole lot of people to move the needle and create change, and it can take just one or two to stop it. And so really being aware of where those threats come from in your community, and doing everything you can to help bring those people on board with the why of the change and to make them part of the change. So that was,
Can I add
yeah.
to that, Amelia? And
Mhm.
there's a, kind of even what we've learned is, is to be super explicit about it. Like even kind of like a, your own sort of general feeling about, yeah, they'd be on board with that, or yeah, we kind of seeming to, kind of go in that direction, is not the same as getting somebody's explicit support for this type of change. And that might mean things like Amelia just described: our contracts change, maybe our roles change in our agency, just describing these real things that could be different, and saying, are we on with this together? Do we share the same values here? So it really is worth it up front to have those super clear, explicit conversations about the change that you are describing. Is that what you also have in mind, and are we in this together about what it might take to actually achieve that?
Yeah, and I think, Katie, that's you know, a really great point. And when we talk about explicit support, we even talk about if we were going into new systems to do change, what would we do differently now? And we're really talking about like a board resolution that says that they're in support of it, so they're fully clear on it, that there's a documented record, that they're not going to try to stop the change that they agreed with in the beginning, but then as things got hard, had some change of heart. So that feels like an important piece too.
Because there's one thing about keeping families together, and there's another thing about like keeping those families together, right?
And we'll get to that value piece for sure.
Yeah.
Um, so the other pieces are really investing in board orientation and training related to the change you're trying to make. There's so much to learn about how the research has changed our thinking about what kids need to thrive, what we've learned about attachment and a child's need for an uninterrupted sense of belonging, what we've learned about the neuroscience and trauma. And, folks who are in decision making capacities are often have very little exposure to this kind of work or some of the reasons why we might do this. So it's important to kind of catch them up early about the why of the work and what substantiates that. This is what Katie was getting to here. I think is really important. I'm going to spend a little time on is the values of decision makers, and what we mean here is we've seen really kind of a resurgence of this idea. If you've been trained in social work and you think back to your history and systems class a long time ago, about the worthy and unworthy poor, right? So our systems were set up on this idea that there's some people who deserve support and some people who don't. Orphans and widows need help because it's not their fault. But people who do drugs or hurt their kids, they don't deserve help, right? Because they made choices. And I'm putting all this in, metaphorical air quotes, because what we know is that, addiction isn't really a choice, and that largely parents who aren't able to safely parent were not safely parented. And in so many cases are our kids that are the product of either circumstances like our kids have been through or our actual system, right? And so really thinking about an empathy first approach where we interject in intergenerational trauma to do that help. So there's a big surgence of this kind of who deserves help. And I'll go a little further to say, it's so important to understand the values of the people making decisions, because we see things popping up that look like this. I would rather spend $100, $100 to make sure that you don't get $1 you didn't earn or don't deserve. So the whole but it's so much more cost effective to do prevention is not the right argument for somebody who believes that it's wrong to help people who don't deserve it, who didn't earn it, who you're taking my money and giving it away to them. Like that's, I'll give you a real life example from one of the systems in which we work. There was a parent who needed treatment in rural community that's far away. So you have to pay a worker, and the worker drives the person and sits while the treatment happens and drives them back to the tune of about $18,000 a year. in that investment. You know, you could buy that person a vehicle for $3,000, $5,000 and save, you know, so much money for the county, but you can't do that. You can't do it, even though it makes great fiscal sense. And if you're looking at a return on investment, it makes so much dollar sense, but you can't do it because what shows up on the front page of the newspaper the next day? County buys drug addict vehicle. Maybe I should do drugs so I can get a free car. Yes. So this is what really, it's so important to understand. It's like the argument that you make has to align with values. It's like, it's not about it's cheaper to do it. It's about why in the world would you give someone who is using drugs a free car? You have to make that argument. Why would you do that? Right. And why might someone use drugs? And what do we know about addiction? And even if we don't care about the person using drugs and they don't deserve our help, what does it mean about that person's children? Like, so in punishing the parent, what are we taking on in terms of the intergenerational impact, you know? So you got to really get to the values early on about who deserves help, who doesn't deserve help. And I mean, I really cannot step away from this without saying explicitly that there is an enormous amount of latent racism built into this as well about who deserves help and who doesn't deserve help. And so, you know, as Katie said, it's sort of like those families, like, yes, children belong with their families, well, except those families, right? And often those people and those families are Black, Brown, and Indigenous families and poor families. And so there's quite a divide in terms of the value statement of who deserves help. Then there is accountability structures and political savviness I want to talk about really quickly too. So what we have seen is that in accountability structures, when there is someone between the leader and the governance body, so in county structures, and we work largely in county structures, when there is a leader and then there's like a county administrator and then the county board, they fare better. When it's a leader right to the board and there's no one in between to run interference, to stand by their side, to help manage it, they don't do as well, right? There's a much greater risk when there isn't someone, or if the person in between is not supportive, right? So it's so important to think about accountability structures and you need just rock solid support of the person in between the leader and the board. And that helps quite a bit to run interference. Um, you know, understanding accountability structures is also very important because what we have noticed is in these processes, they are often blatantly violated. And so I'll give you an example. um, when people don't act as you might expect. So when the police don't agree with you and they go to a school and remove a child from the school, there's no threat of harm in the school. That's not a legal thing to do. In fact, that's like legal kidnapping. You can't do that because you can only remove like that when there's imminent threat. But if the department doesn't think the child should be removed, but the police do, and they just go get the child and refuse to return him home, you know, what do you do then? What do you even do when it's the police doing that? Or what do you do when a judge orders, you know, um, kind of issues an unfair order to punish a parent to put them in jail and not allow them to speak to their children? What do you do? What do you do when you have a rogue county board member who is using relationships to go, you know, to another department? What do you do when there's challenges in the county department and the corporation counsel represents both the police and the Department of Human Services? And essentially, the conflict is between police and human services. Who represents the department? And who represents the police? A special counsel should be appointed in that situation. And what do you do if the board won't appoint special counsel? So this is what I mean when I say really thinking about the accountability structures and where do you go if they're not working as you expect? So what happens in that case, right? Like, who are the right lawyers to talk to? Who are the right advocacy organizations in your state? Where might you go for advice about how to handle things like that? Learning about if your district attorney is doing things that you think are not on the up and up, where do you report that person, or where's the accountability for people in authority? That's a really important thing to understand. And if you're just trying to figure it out, while you're in the middle of it, it gets really complicated. So just kind of even talking through that before a change effort, like what's our agreement if this happens, this happens, this happens, where do we go, right?
And,
What's
and
the
even
mechanism?
and even
Mhm.
to know who can fire you in your position. Who are you accountable to? Are you accountable to, like, your, your board, or what? How does that all move there too? And as you said, Amelia, it behooves you to understand these structures before you get into it. You don't want to get into this position last minute. I also want to just elevate something from the chat, Amelia. That's how do you facilitate conversations, bringing out the values with decision makers? How do you get them to be explicit about who they think deserves help or doesn't? And do you try to change what they value, or how do you move the change? If you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I would say just to have those explicit conversations in advance, like here's the why and here's what we're trying to do. And sometimes it's going to feel like people don't deserve this help, right? And and even if we think they don't deserve it, we have to think about what's the impact to the children, right? So we cannot help this parent and then have this kid grow up in 10 different foster homes and then have them, end up in our prisons or homeless in our community. We can do that even though the parent doesn't deserve it. Or we can help someone who we don't think deserves it because we were really trying to help the children and we have learned what the children need is for their parents to be okay, right? So I mean, I would just like explicitly talk about what if we feel this way and why might we still help someone that many people don't think deserve it? Why would we still do it? Right. And to just have the conversations about in what cases would there be someone who you don't think we should help? Right. What would that be if we help someone who you didn't think we should have? What would be that kind of tipping point for you? Like, okay, I get it. I'm willing to help these, but this, no way. Like that's not even our role. Yeah. Just to talk through some of those things in advance. So the other is kind of this political savviness is really around that idea of like, where are the relationships? Who holds the power? Who can make decisions? Those kinds of things. And then, and really thinking about as we talk about preparing for resistance, like I said, it can come from any place. And a way to think about that is who has the most to lose? Who has something to lose? And that's often where you see the resistance. In another preparing before you start, really, this is about personal protection, right? So leaders recommending that they have the right experts and resources at the ready. And that means having a personal attorney at the ready, having access to a communications expert when you need a counter narrative, having a list of if something goes down, who do you need to contact? What is a crisis response list? Who are all the people you need to get information to? But the thing that we have learned in this process is that it takes a really long time to find an attorney. That's what I'll say, is you can contact 10 of them and nobody will get back to you for weeks on end. And so it's really important to have that relationship at the ready should you need it. And so that's something that I feel like we didn't really get until we needed attorneys and leaders needed attorneys. As you go, an important piece is to own your own change effort. So it's really important not to say, oh, these people think we should change. These people are leading the change. Here's what they told us to do. It's like, no, it has to be yours as a leader. You have to say, I'm changing, they're helping, and they're helping, and they're helping, but I'm leading this. And if you do not own the change process, what we've seen is it kind of puts you in a one down position. It's like people question your leadership, like, oh, you're just, drinking the Kool-Aid from so and so, or, you've really got to kind of own that and say, this is mine. It's my decisions. I'm making the decisions here. And we're getting support from other places. That feels like a really important lesson learned as well. And then coming back to share your data and your story often, you have to go back to the what we're doing, why we're doing it, the progress we're seeing, what we're learning. You can't just say it once and go off and expect people, well, I told you that. We talked about this 2 years ago. You should know this. It's a really regular update to constantly re-up the buy-in. Like, you know, It's not just for information, it's, and you're still in this with me, right? You're constantly re-upping that buy-in to the story. Another piece that we have learned is that one person can't do this alone. If you're talking about this idea of, you've got to have relationships with your police departments and your nonprofits and your schools and every county board member, which there could be, 20, 30 of them, everyone inside your organization, your entire staff. It's just a ridiculous amount of relationships for one person to hold. And so another piece that has been more effective is having kind of a two for relationship where someone manages internal and somebody external relationships like that, but just to kind of divide and share responsibility for primary connection and relationship. Did you have something, Katie?
Yeah, I was going to just kind of reiterate a piece about the board, and we have, considered now, kind of looking back, what it might be to have a more robust board orientation or some kind of ongoing learning, because it is certainly the case that folks on your board may or may not understand the choices that you have to make in your department, or the issues that are coming, or the trends that you're seeing in your community as far as, drug addiction or mental health or whatever is happening. And so having some orientation in the beginning for new board members, this kind of ongoing training to just reflect some of the things that are ACEs. A lot of people don't know about that even. So is a real investment that's worth your time.
And just to say that if you let that gap get too wide between what you're doing and what you know and what they know, there tends to be a rebounding power grab to say, we know what we're doing. We don't need somebody else to tell us that. We care about kids too. We're going to put you in your place and take you down a notch because you're getting, as my mom would say, kind of too big for your britches, right? It's like, who do you think you are? And so there's an exercise of power when people feel the gap is too big and they start to feel like they're looked down on or they don't get it, or people are like, oh, you just don't understand. If that starts to happen in that gap, people will reinstate themselves into a position of power, even if it doesn't make sense for what's best for the community or others. It's like it's a natural response to kind of a defense response, I think. So the other is to kind of lean into difficult relationships. It's a human nature to avoid people with whom we have conflict, to avoid people who are difficult, and to try to kind of stay away from those relationships and avoid them. But it's really important to lean into those kind of, the old adage of keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Like you do not want to avoid people with whom you do not agree, because it will come back to bite you. So stay in those relationships and do everything you can to build trust and connection there. And then the other is resisting the temptation to go too fast. And one of our favorite books, I'll show a picture of later is Leadership on the Line, which was written by Heifetz and Linsky out of Harvard. And they've actually helped us with some of this work. They've met with us over COVID and helped us through some of this thinking. But they talk about turning up the temperature too high, and how hot can it get where people are like can't stand the heat and they start to bail and the effort fails. It's like you got to turn it up a little bit at a time, and doing change in increments that people can tolerate. So you can't outpace sort of the human capacity for change. And there's a desire, there's an urgency to go quickly, but if you go too quickly, things start to kind of fall apart. So that's an important lesson too. So we also have just talked with some folks at Casey who have these early lessons of leaders they interviewed years ago, and this is their kind of top learnings as well, which really align with what we're seeing, which is leaders who succeed have the following in common: they have a clear vision, they have clear data, they own their vision, and they return to that vision and data throughout the change process. So building that case for change and rallying others around it and bringing others with you is a really important piece of the change. And you're not going to be able to bring everybody, but you're going to have to bring the right people, right? The people who can make the difference.
And can I add too, Amelia, that although it looks really simple on that slide, that's a really difficult process. I mean, to
Yeah.
just say, here's what I'm trying to do, here's why I think, here's the data that support it. We spent a lot of time with our cohort early on. It's like, what exactly are we trying to do here? Is it about placements? Is it about connections? Is it about number of kids? Is it actually it's about parents? So all that to say, it's not necessarily really easy. Just like, this is what I'm trying to do, this is the data that back it up, but to be able to answer that question for yourself. And in the cohort too, we even did role plays in front of different audiences, and just to fill in like this sentence: because of this is what we're seeing in our community, this is what we're trying to do, and these are our interventions, here's what we why we think it'll work. I mean, just filling that super easy template, simple, not easy, again, is just like that's the mantra that you want to be able to repeat over and over and over again.
That's right. So, to protect yourself, just like as I said, just knowing one or two people can really stop your efforts. So know who they are and keep them close, and work on building that connection and relationship, and creating champions where you can. And really, it's exhausting to do this change work. It feels like, why is it so hard to do good? I mean, there is quite a pushback. It can really get to you if you're not careful about making sure that you nurture and protect yourself and your team so that you're able to sustain the change, right? So really thinking about leaders who need to take care of themselves in order um, to make it work, because it is a lonely um, place to be. And often, if you're taking 1-2 punches on a regular basis, you're going to need to have some very heightened leadership fortitude and self-care. Um, Another is really just a lesson we have learned in the cohort to apply here, which is expand your group of helpers. And that just means, partnerships, partnerships, partnerships. And frankly, when things get rough and people come at you, you can't be the one saying, no, really, I'm doing a great job. No, really, this change is so good and important, right? Because of course you're going to say that. If that happens to, if for example, I'm under attack, it's so much more impactful if Laurel can stand up and say, I vouch for her. This is good change. I have seen good things come. That's so much more impactful than me making the argument for the good I'm doing. And so having those relationships, having those partnerships is really important, to be able to have people speak on your behalf and stand up for you. I'll tell you another story of a jurisdiction we were in where a leader came under fire, and it ended up that she ended up leaving, and the community groups who were involved in that system were so, in retrospect, upset about it, and said, why didn't you come to us? Like, we would have supported you. We would have stood by you. We would have said that what you were doing was good for families in our community. But it didn't even really cross her mind to think about that. You know what I'm saying? And so it's just so important to know that who are the families you are helping? Who are the community members who understand what you're trying to do and who see the good impact in the community? And might they be able to stand up on your behalf? So nurturing those relationships, or youth who have aged out of the system and know how seriously it needs to change. Can they speak about their experience and why this change is necessary? So just thinking about partnerships, who could stand by you, who could say it for you when it just is skeptical, if people are skeptical if you say it, right? That's a really important thing as well. Okay. So then, the last piece about this is that we need to think about, how do we protect our change makers if we're not the leaders, but we're people who believe in what they are doing. If we're people who think about, this is a movement I believe in, and I'm watching people come after the change maker, what do I do? So one is, you can kind of bear witness to the change, talk about the change, the good you've seen in the change, the reason for the change, to share those opinions publicly, like in op-eds, letters to the editor, um, you know, uh, to be interviewed about that, to write letters to local officials, to write letters to your county board members, or to meet with your state representatives and to tell them the story. Are there ways to really share these opinions publicly and to form relationships with decision makers to be a way to influence them as well? And then I really cannot say enough about this, but become a decision maker. Run for local office. The people who are running for local office are often unopposed, often do not have experience or background in the kind of change that needs to be made. And so to just really think seriously about running for county board or encouraging others who are allies for families to run for local office or school board or county boards who can be a voice on behalf of families. So really to think about on your own, how can you be brave on their behalf? How might you build alliances or advocate? How might you get others together and mobilize? How might you stand up next to someone who's trying to make a change, who's under attack? How might you be able to speak out? Because I'll tell you what happens. When change happens and people start coming for the change maker, they quickly have cooties. Like, I don't want to, yeah, I don't want to stand too close to him because the tide is turned. And then they might come for me. And this is totally natural human behavior. I want you to think back to middle school, right? I mean, how hard it is to stand up for the kid being bullied because you're going to be in the line of fire if you stand next to the kid being bullied. Now you become a target of bullying, right? It's so much easier to say nothing and stand back or to align with the people who have power, right? To be like, yeah, I don't like him either. That's so much easier than standing next to the kid being bullied. And in our grown-up lives, where we have a better ability to protect ourselves, it really is incumbent upon us to stand next to the people who are being targeted because it's really almost never about them. It's that they are going first and representing the change that we're all trying to make. It is almost never about them. So in every system I am talking about, in every system, there was not a single incident of child harm or death. It was not that things went wrong. It was that they went right. It was that they were able to keep more kids home safely. It was that they were able to reduce residential numbers. So it was not malfeasance. It wasn't that things went wrong. It wasn't that there was a safety risk. It was that real change was happening. And people will let you tweak around the edges and do little bitty things and they'll leave you all the way alone. But when they believe you're going to do real change or meaningful change, or when it comes to a point where they believe they're going to have to give something up, their power, their knowledge, their standing, whatever it is, then they come for you. And the tide turns quickly. And it does not have to have any kind of logical basis to it. That's the other thing. Like, it's like, what happened? Well, nothing actually, but there's still an investigation, right? Even though nothing happened. And so it's really important to know that we are powerful in numbers and that these people who, these leaders who I opened up with saying I have just the utmost respect for, it's not just enough to have respect. You have to do something to help protect them. You have to speak out and say something publicly, which puts your own self at risk. It sure does. And nothing ever changes if we just get part of the way and then take out the change makers. It's why things don't change. So it's so important. So something I want to share with you about that is, this book, it's a must read for change leaders. Leadership on the Line is what we're referring to, and Heifetz and Linsky, who we have had contact with, who read our guidance for change leaders that's at the end of the year 1 cohort report and have talked us through. And one thing I think, Katie, you can add in here if you feel differently, but one thing that they just really said to us is understand the other side of the story, that those folks are going to bed at night feeling like they're doing the right things for kids and families. They really believe they're protecting their community and they're protecting kids. They've figured out a way to make that true for themselves, right? And so you have to figure out, what is that about? What is the story that they're telling themselves about how this is the right way to go? and how they're protecting their community. And that gets back to our values discussion and helps you to really have a different kind of conversation. So you're not defending what you're doing, you're understanding more deeply why is it that they think this other approach is the right way, and then how do we find middle. And that's going to be something all of us are going to have to get really good at, not only in our work and change in child welfare, but just in being with our neighbors and our family. Yeah, we're going to have to all figure out there are truths in every side. How might we come to the middle to be the best we can for the kids and families who need us so desperately? So that's an important piece of it, is that book, which I'm going to recommend. And then I've got a little bit more to say, but we wanted to take a pause and really open it up for questions at this point, or comments. Your chat has been super rich and appreciate that so much. But are there others who want to add or ask at this point?
Feel free to unmute yourself too if you just want to just enter the conversation. Go ahead and do that, or use the chat.
And we welcome just really anything you want to add, including like, yes, I've seen that. Amen from the choir. You're full of it. That can't be true.
I mean, I've seen this. I've seen it all happening exactly as you described. And yeah, so I think I unfortunately did not prepare as much as I should have, because I think I stepped into a lot of the change making without realizing it. And so I think I was ill prepared for the role that I unintentionally stepped into, because I think I was naive in thinking things were better than they were. And so I am currently a licensed foster parent, and found it to be very unsettling how things are working currently. And I was the one pushing back against the current system. And I think, unfortunately, the kiddos that were in my care were the ones to suffer the most. And it's just really frustrating and unsettling. And so now I'm at the point where there are lies flying all around about me. And so I'm stepping into kind of a different role, which is, foster care reform, and just doing respite care for kiddos that are already in care, but working towards supporting families and preventing kids coming into care. And so, yeah, I think it was just a really rude awakening.
Yeah, and it can be, I mean, it's the 1-2 punches are pretty brutal. And so I'm sorry for what you have been through. And I'm encouraged to hear that you're not quite done, that you're staying with it in a new way. And that's great. I mean, the change we're talking about and the pushback, just remember, or, you know, at least I think about this. We've been talking about foster care reform, but honestly, we have not taken on the implicit, explicit, and systemic racism in our system. And so if you think it's hard now, when we're talking about the worthy and unworthy, and when we're talking about foster care reform and all there is, so just wait till we add race to that discussion to see how that is going to really, increase the temperature of what we're doing. So I don't expect this to go in an easy fashion, right? So people with power almost never willingly give it up, and so I do expect that the next step of our evolution as a system in child welfare, the next step of grading, really reducing, eliminating disparities and gaining greater equity and support for all families is going to be something that we will need to fortify ourselves for. I don't expect that to go incredibly easily. But there are lessons that we have learned. There are things we can do to be more prepared. There are ways that we can come through this next set of change together with, more ability to be sustainable and more fortified for that next process. So, and a big part of that is doing that together with other people who believe as you do. Like building a coalition of the willing is so important, really, with people who understand what you're trying to do and are willing to be brave with you. Mhm.
And I like what Kim brought up too, as far as there is a difference between leading and change making. We've talked about that really elevating as different. It's one thing to be a strong leader in your organization and execute your mission and values and set a vision that kind of way, and it's a whole other thing to decide to make changes and change your system. And that's what we're really talking about over here. And I think it was Deb that mentioned it up front about, are you guys teaching this, or somebody teaching this to the new social workers? Like, who's learning how to do this? And that's a really great point. And I think it, as it becomes clear to us that it's another skill set, so that part of piece of it I wanted to say. And then what I was also thinking, Amelia, as you were talking about, and what reminded me again is somebody asked a question about judges, or for those of us working with judges, which is a particular challenge, isn't it? Is that there's like this sort of different, there's a way to sort of engage. So like, how do you build this communication and build unconditional positive regard and constant communication with somebody? So that's that engagement piece, sort of the soft piece. But then Amelia also mentions, of course, like, what can they actually not do that you need to kind of hold their feet to the fire? Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of like a going back and forth between like engagement, and then it's like, and you just got to knock some stuff off where they are going over the line. Do you know what I mean?
Which is like every good relationship, right? It's like
Right.
engaging in it and holding boundary. There's
Right.
an element of self-protection in every healthy relationship. It's like, no, actually, no, you can't talk to me like that. And I super love you and want to connect with you, but no. So it's like every relationship, holding that back and forth. I think Erin asked me about states or administered systems, and we have worked on state administered systems as well. And really, it's kind of the same kind of thing as getting alignment at the state level, but then really eating the elephant a bite at a time. So by region or county and small areas. So I'm part of our theory of change we didn't really talk about is we work with early adopters and innovators. So we work with people who ask us to work with them. We work with people who want to do the change. Then the key is that you're never going to get a system where everybody wants to do the change, right? So it's like some do and some don't. Maybe the leader does, but others don't. And so just thinking through that, I'd say, going where there is momentum, going where there is alignment, and starting where you can, doing what you can, and then scaling and spreading from there. So is what I'd recommend. I'm going to share another slide here, unless there's something else in the chat. Katie, I just saw a long post.
Yeah. So we kind of got like a yeah, kind of some high fives. And in particular, Leah said said this about an article. Something that stuck with her was this quote: "Don't underestimate how much people want things to stay the same."
Yeah.
So as much as deep in your heart as you feel like there needs to be a change, you've got folks that deeply believe that we are on track. So and that is, again, we just want to refer back to the Heifetz-Zielinski too, and an approach of change as loss. And it is like people have feelings about it and really are invested in it and feel stupid or misplaced or out of, all these things that we cannot underestimate. As Leah says, people that response, that visceral, like human response to connecting with this type of work. So thanks for adding that.
And Kim, I would also recommend that book, System Thinking for Social Change, is a great change guidance, a read as well, if you're embarking on the change. So the last few things we wanted to do here is I wanted to offer some encouragement to say, more than half of this is just not taking your ball and going home. So it gets so frustrating. You just think like, forget it. It's so hard to do good, or I've said it so many ways, like they just keep pushing back, or they don't get it, or they're coming for me. Like it's like, feeling like nobody wants to play with you and they're not following the rules and they kick the kickball in your face. And you're like, I'm just going to take my ball and go home. I just want to go home, right? Where it's safe. And my encouragement to you is to not take your ball and go home, to stay at the game, to stay on the field, because it requires that we do that in order for us to make change. If we all take our balls and go home, then just the old way continues to move on. And so it is hard. And it is, if you have those memories from being a kid of, not being picked for the team, or having somebody say a hard thing, or you just want to go where it's safe. And what I have to offer you is it's really not safe even if you leave, because what needs to happen for kids and families, and that continues. And so really just encouraging you to stay on the playground. That's half of the battle, is to stay on the playground. And just to say that the universe really rewards persistence. So many times where I have felt like, oh, this is not going to end well, or it's not going to turn out right, or it turned out terrible. What good could come from this? If I play the long game, if I stay at it, if I stay with it, if I just remain in relationship, if I keep coming back to the table, if I don't take my ball and go home, inevitably, good has come from that and has shifted to that. And either I was learning something I needed to learn to prepare myself for the next big battle, or there was a change that I just never could imagine that ended up being quite good. So I say to my team, often that after I take a series of punches, I almost always get a reward to remind me I'm on the right path. So after things get really bad and I feel like, oh, like it's been a week, man, I've taken a whole bunch of 1-2 punches, we're due for a gift. We're due for a gift. Something good almost always comes to remind me to stay on the playground. So that is largely what we were hoping to share with you today. We would love to stay in touch with you and to have you sign up for our newsletter and our social media as well. And for you to continue to share your stories. We are deeply, deeply committed to learning everything we can and sharing everything we can with people who are at this hard work of change, and supporting people in any way we can as well. And so want to just say thank you for the ways you participated, both verbally and in the chat today, and for being here today. And Katie, do you want to close us up?
Yeah, I just want to say would love to hear from you. You can email us. All of our stuff's on the website. Take all the stuff that you can find. Yeah, sign up for the newsletter. Thanks, Cody. And if you are just in a real moment in your change making process, just a reminder that you are in the middle of the story, that this is not the end, that you might still be writing the chapter of like how we turned it all around. So just a little charge there to, again, as Amelia said, to keep going. Sometimes you need to sub out of the game, but sub back in, but just stay with it. So, and we're with you. Give us a call, drop us a line. We'd love to support you in any way we can.